Hello, my name's Daniel Holtgen. I work for the Council of Europe, and I have the great honor and pleasure to host a panel here today on environment, climate change, and human rights. I want to tell you a bit about that in a moment. Before that, however, I want to introduce a really exquisite panel to you. I am so honored to have three such experienced and really high-profile panelists today. And I would like to start with Clover Hogan. Clover is what I would call a global citizen. She was born in Australia. She worked and studied in Indonesia. She lives in London today. And she is exquisite in a way because she spent half of her life saving this planet. And she does this by talking to young people, encouraging young people to throw away their inhibitions and their angst and work for a better future. I think you should speak more often to older people as well, like myself, to encourage them to have that motivation. You work for various organizations as a strategist, as an advisor, as a consultant. So it's not only young people who benefit from your advice and your experience, it's also companies and the public sector. So thank you very much for joining us on this panel. It's a great honor for me to host this panel with you. Can I then turn to Aron Cramer. Welcome to the panel. You are president of BSR, which I guess stands from business and social responsibility, but I think you're moving also into more broader issues, poverty, fighting poverty, and also climate change. You advise 250 member companies on these issues, and also you advise and are on the boards of big multinationals such as Marks & Spencer's and SAP. You've co-written a book called Sustainable Excellence, the future of business in a fast-changing world, and you're often quoted in many media such as Figaro, the Financial Times, Le Monde, and others, and I'm sure you'll be quoted in many more, particularly after this session. Welcome to the panel, Aron.
Thank you.
Paul, it's also a great honor to have you on the panel. You are the co-founder and chair of Imagine. You work with business leaders to address climate change, so you're very, very suitable and equipped to advise us here on this panel today as well. You sit on many boards and advise the International Chamber of Commerce, the Said Business School at Oxford University, and also an organization called the B Team. I think you're very much part of the A team today. And of course, we shouldn't forget that you were CEO of Unilever for 10 years. And for that, you were described as a standout COE of C.E.O. Sorry, that was COE is the acronym of my organization. Sorry, Council of Europe. CEO of the past decade. But you're very much present here. And one thing that we have in common, which I read, I'm not sure if it's true, you once considered priesthood in the Catholic Church. I don't know if that's true. Well, we've both taken a different way, but I think all of us here today are working for a better future and using our experience for a better future, for future generations. Let me just tell you about the Council of Europe and the environment. This is a relatively new area for the Council of Europe. Indeed, the European Convention on Human Rights doesn't actually mention the environment, but more and more people are turning to us, turning to the European Convention to solve environmental problems. In fact, already 300 cases have been dealt with at the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg dealing with the issue of environment. Sometimes not directly. Sometimes it's the issue of the right to property, the right to family life, and also the right to a fair trial and other issues. For example, already in 1994, a Turkish citizen took a case to the court because a waste disposal facility caused a methane explosion and 9 people lost their lives. And she took the Turkish authorities and the government to court successfully, and she claimed the violation of the right to life. But more recently, what is very interesting is not only individuals taking their case to our court, but the member states themselves having to change their legislation because their governments have been taken to national courts with the European Convention in mind and as a background. So you probably all know the case of the Netherlands, which has now changed its climate objectives because it was taken to its Supreme Court on the basis of the European Convention on Human Rights. So human rights and the environment are connected today. The question is, how can we address this as individuals? So I would like, if I may, to start with a question to you, Clover. You have spent a lot of time working with young people in particular, trying to get rid of their angst, their inhibitions, and turning that helplessness into something active. Now, we're all faced at the moment with a completely different crisis, the pandemic. Do you think we can turn people's justified, perhaps, fear that they have into something more positive, to look beyond the pandemic or to help overcome it? I think some of your work is related to the mental state of mind when we are faced with crises. How do you think we can improve that situation in the face of the pandemic?
Absolutely. So the climate crisis is the symptom of broken systems. From the clothes I'm wearing to the food in my fridge or how I got here from London. And so the change that is required is at that system level. There is no hope in another 10 years of incremental change. Now, the bedrock of these broken systems is a system of capitalism based on limitless growth with finite resources entrenched in a centuries-long history of the oppression of marginalized communities of color, of women, of indigenous people, the custodians of our land. And it's also based on a millennia-long history of the commodification of nature, valuing the tree not for its ecosystem services and the oxygen that enables us to breathe, but for the table it provides or the palm oil going into one of our chocolate bars. Now, ecological crises, of which the pandemic is one, the pandemic is caused by this exploitation of nature, show us not just how broken these very systems are, but how fragile and how ripe for disruption. We have an opportunity before us as we're forced to press pause on our hyper-consumptive, globalized lives to think about the future that we want to create and to think about how each and every one of us, politicians, business leaders, concerned mums and dads, students, can step up to become custodians, to rethink so much of how we live, breathe, and exist in the 21st century. And I believe that one of the most underutilized and one of the most powerful tools that we have is that of mindset. For me, the threat greater even than climate change, greater even than any pandemic, is the feeling of powerlessness in the face of these existential threats. Fear is an incredible motivator when it relates to an immediate threat. For our ancestors, a saber-toothed tiger leaping at us from the bush, or for us, for me in London, someone on an e-scooter swerving onto the sidewalk. But fear, in the context of an existential challenge, like climate change, like a pandemic, fear breeds apathy. It breeds nihilism. It breeds the belief that we are too small to make a difference and that the system is too broken to create meaningful change. And that is why I believe that one of the most powerful things that we can do is begin to rewrite the stories that we hold to be true about the world and about our role in it, and shift from this place, as you said, of anxiety to real agency.
That's fascinating. Thank you very much. Thank you. Can I talk to you, Aron, turn to you? I have a question to you. You've worked with governments and international organizations, with businesses in tackling climate change. How do you think you could work, or how could these entities work to promote fundamental rights. Is that the same kind of issue? I mean, freedom of speech, freedom to go out and demonstrate, because we are seeing, as our Secretary General said earlier on, some erosion of our fundamental rights. Is that something that concerns businesses as well as climate change? Does it interact? What's your view on this?
Thank you, Daniel, and I'm sorry I can't be with you in person. Speaking from the United States, let me start by saying that our democracy here is undergoing an existential test right now. And I don't know if any of you were up at 4 a.m. in Athens to watch our presidential debate, but I fear that democratic norms and institutions and processes are facing a very substantial challenge. This is something that Europeans know all too well from the tragic history of the 20th century. We cannot take democracy for granted, and there is absolutely a role for business to play, and a role that business, in my view, must play to help reinforce the very foundational element of our societies. Our societies cannot thrive in a place where democracy recedes, and no business can either. So this is one of our additional challenges, in addition to climate, in addition to COVID, in addition to the erosion of human rights. I think for businesses, it's time to think about how they can help create 21st century social contracts that reinforce democratic principles, ensure that the private sector and capitalism is aligned towards social benefit and not just the privatization of benefit, ensure that people can have the livelihoods that they need to thrive, ensure that businesses have access to the kinds of capabilities and talents that they need to thrive, and then also take on 21st century challenges that were never part of the social contract previously. How do we transition to a net zero carbon economy in a way that ensures that people are not left behind? And of course, as Clover said, marginalized communities, including racial minorities and also women, are disproportionately at risk from climate change. So we have to build a net zero economy that ensures that all can participate. And then we have to think about technologies. How can we bring new technologies to market, capture the amazing opportunities they present, while also ensuring that human rights are protected? I'll close with a brief story. I came to BFR 25 years ago tomorrow to start a human rights program. At that point in corporate America, there was one person with the word human rights on a business card. Today, I think we've seen hundreds, if not thousands of companies embrace the human rights agenda. And we need to reinforce that and advance that at a time when all of these systemic changes are flowing together to create the need to make sure that all of our rights are protected. And that's the only way we can thrive.
Thank you very much for that response. And I would like directly to turn to you, Paul. We've spoken a lot about how governments have responded to the pandemic. And our Secretary General was speaking about multilateral cooperation. In fact, some people have been missing multilateral cooperation. States have been having very different responses, perhaps not very coordinated. Where do you think there is a possibility for proper multilateral cooperation in fighting the pandemic, but also in climate change? Where do you see the deficits, and where would you like to see more and better multilateral cooperation on the pandemic and on the climate change? And again, the same question, do you see any links between the two?
I also think that the ESG multi-stakeholder, longer-term business models are actually accelerating. The crisis has shown that companies that operate under the more responsible models, taking care of multiple stakeholders, are not surprisingly also the ones that do better during the crisis. Better engaged employees, less pressures, if you want to, better relationships with their suppliers. Now, what we've seen in the COVID crisis once more, I think, is the difficulty of global governance that we now face, as well as governments at a national level. Increasingly, the issues that we face, like the issues of the interdependence of the financial market, cybersecurity, climate change, and now also the pandemics, require without any doubt a global response. These issues know no borders, if I may call it that way. And yet we have seen that we got about 86 countries putting export restrictions in place around PPE materials. We've seen a lack of cooperation between governments in terms of solidarity. The developing markets, in fact, hardly any cause of the issues that we're now facing, have gotten virtually zero support from the developed markets. So global governance is without any doubts at a low. And the reason it is at a low is that most of the institutions that have been created were created 70 years ago at the time of Bretton Woods. And frankly, unlike businesses or others who might have adjusted their strategies 10, 15, 20 times, global governance has not evolved. The second reason why we have a deep drought in global governance is because of the people we've elected. Because we frankly haven't addressed the issues of climate change, of inequality, of exclusion from our economic process, it is without any doubt that people have turned to the polls to express their dissatisfaction. And unfortunately, this has resulted in many countries, from Brazil to Mexico to Russia to Turkey to the US, in a form of populism or nationalism that is not conducive for rationally solving these issues that we're talking about. And the debate you saw yesterday night is probably a sad lowlight, may I say, in what politicians giving us now as examples of what type of leaders we have elected. The reality is that we're not moving fast enough. Even before COVID, we were on the trajectory of a 3-degree plus global warming. And despite all the noise that was out there, we see the traction being well below what is needed. We only have 12 countries or 13 countries that have now come in with higher ambitions on climate change versus their Paris submissions. Most countries are still well behind what the original agreements were. On the private sector, we have seen movement, and movement has accelerated, no question about it. But we also have to be honest there. Only about 25% global GDP has made climate commitments. And if you really look at the commitments that are needed for Paris to stay at net zero by 2050, that number goes down significantly. About 1,000 companies or slightly more than that. So as Clover pointed out, we cannot expect the changes that we need to happen if we keep operating in a system that is not designed to give us the results that we are after. So increasingly, we need to look at some of the parameters that need to solve these issues. And it cannot happen with the private sector alone, nor can civil society do this alone. We really need the governments to work together and put the right frameworks and conditions in place to move that possible. The first thing would be, for example, a financial market that needs to be focused on the longer term so that businesses get the space to address these issues. Currently, many businesses will simply complain that they don't get the space to work on these multi-stakeholder models. The second thing we need to do is start to measure different things. If we only measure the return on financial capital, this is what we get. Maximizing shareholder return has only brought us so far. And frankly, that's not what we want, we're discovering. 90% of people don't like this form of capitalism. So we need to move to a system where we also measure environmental and social capital. call it a national well-being or happiness index. And governments are starting to look at that. The third thing is that we need to force the broader cooperation. The issues that we are talking about today on this panel are of such magnitude that none of them can do this alone. So business, civil society, and the government need to get together to attack these issues. Not only putting new frameworks in place around the long-termism or different ways of accounting, but also aggressively putting the policies in place to ensure that we have a green recovery. Then the biggest issue of social injustice is not only the victims that we see currently, it is the wave of unemployment that is coming, that is disproportionately going to affect once more the young, the women, and the vulnerable, just as we've seen in the first wave of COVID. And it requires all of us to look at a recovery that actually generates the right jobs, more resilient jobs, better paying jobs, more respected jobs. And it happens to be that a conversion to a green economy by taking care of our biodiversity, retrofitting buildings, moving to mobility systems, investing in education and R&D, all these things give us a better return on investment and create the right jobs of the future, not the jobs of the past. Unfortunately, my final sentence, of the $12 trillion that governments now collectively have spent, mainly in Europe and the US, to stabilize this economy, not even to rescue it or come out of it, only a very minor percentage of that spending has gone to greening the economy. And in fact, we are spending double the amount of support behind the old fossil fuel industries than we do with the new. We missed the boat during the financial crisis in 2007, 2008. It gave us Trump, it gave us Brexit. We don't want to miss the boat again, because these cycles don't wait 10 years. And they're going to become to such an extent that they are irreparable. And we're at that crucial moment now. So this is not only a warning sign for all of us, but it is a sign that this is the moment to rise to the challenge. And I agree once more with Clover that the main asset that is missing now, the main thing that we need is this human willpower to attack the issues. Do we really care? And that's probably something we need to focus on more than some of the mechanics of how to do it.
Thank you, Paul. A lot of food for thought there. One thing that came to mind was you were talking about governments, multinationals, that we have missed the boat. Luckily, there was another boat in the next sentence, and we can jump on that one, I noticed. But one thing you mentioned only in passing, and this brings me back to Clover, but the question goes to all of you. We may have missed the boat for our generation, but what about the next generation? And what about youth involvement? All these decisions you've talked about are made by people, mainly men, mainly white men, above 40, including myself. Where is diversity in this? How can we bring young people into the decision-making process in economics, in multilateral decisions, in parliaments? Or is this simply wishful thinking or an illusion? Maybe I'll ask you first for a response, Clover.
Sure. So.
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
It's a really great question because it's something that I've been thinking about a lot in the context of the Black Lives Matter movement and our failure in the climate and environmental space to shift the conversation away from polar bears and solar panels to how climate solutions must deliver fair, equitable, social contracts where we all have equal access to opportunity, where we all have the right to live dignified, respectful lives built on purpose. And we need to become much better at shifting conversations from closed-door rooms to involve and center the very people who are experiencing these impacts firsthand. I come from a bubble of privilege, and while I might have the opportunity to speak in air-conditioned rooms about climate change, there are young people on the front lines of this movement whose livelihoods are at stake, whose homes are getting swept away by rising sea levels, whose food systems are collapsing. And until we deliver solutions that are inclusive and that position the very stakeholders in the center of these conversations, all of our proposed solutions are going to be linear in the context of exponential challenges. So it's critical that we come at this from the question of who isn't in the room and how can we get them there. And in terms of the role of intergenerational exchange, I feel with the Youth Strikes for Climate, there's been a bit of a breakdown in communication, and there has been a lot of othering and a lot of blame getting thrown around. And I've worked with a lot of adults who kind of point the finger at young people and say, well, you don't know what you're talking about, you don't understand how complex this is, and lots of young people pointing the finger and saying, well, you're the reason we're in this situation. And ultimately, our conversations need to shift beyond that point to appreciate that actually we can deliver these solutions when we bring together the energy of young people with the knowledge of experience. But that will only be made possible when the people in existing positions of power choose to give up that power, and that's difficult. Power does not naturally give itself up, and yet we must reduce power to the smallest unit possible so that more people, marginalized communities, can come into the center of this conversation and be supported to deliver on the solutions.
Thank you very much. Aron.
Yeah, I mean, in addition to generational justice, which is incredibly important, there's a very practical way that this is influencing how the world is changing. One of the reasons that some of the oil and gas companies have begun to move on climate change more decisively is because they recognize that they can no longer attract the best and the brightest. They simply won't have an employee base if they don't join the 21st century and contribute what's needed in a very profound way on climate. It's very unlikely that Amazon would have moved on climate without a very public display from its employees, and mostly its younger employees, to demand quite publicly that the company adopt an approach that was compatible with what we need to do on climate. I'll flatter Paul a bit, and I know that when he was the CEO of Unilever, Unilever would appear in various lists of the most desirable places to work amongst Gen X and Millennial and Gen Z, or Gen Z and Millennials, because of the company's commitment to sustainability. And it was seen, Unilever's been seen as a cool place to work because of that commitment. So businesses have to understand that the talent, 21st century talent, expects that we take on these big social issues, not least climate change. And without that, the pool of talent will not be available, and no company can possibly survive or thrive without that.
Thank you. Paul.
You know, the issue of the young is terribly important, but there is a bigger issue that is coming out with COVID as well, and that is the issue of exclusion of too many people. A world where too many people feel they're not participating or be excluded ultimately rebels against itself. And what COVID has shown is the discrimination that is happening between many different things. The developing countries I talked about, the generational difference you mentioned, the communities difference of indigenous people versus others which have disproportionately been affected, the differences between ethnic classes we've talked about, the difference in gender. What this has done is brought to the foreground that this world is functioning for increasingly fewer people at the expense of others. We now have a small group of 500 people that own $6 trillion. The top 4 people own over $500 billion, and we know them by name. And since January, their combined wealth has gone up 700 billion, whilst the rest of the world is suffering. These increasingly smaller islands of prosperity in these oceans of poverty are not going to work. So the essence of the Sustainable Development Goals is to leave no one behind. The essence of that is total inclusion. We cannot make things work if we don't first and foremost put the people we serve in the middle and respect in the process that we find solutions for the people on the ground, not for the few that again will work very hard to make the current system stick as it works for them. So the young have a special role to play because it happens to be that 50% of the world population is below 35 years old. They happen to be 100% tomorrow. It's also that they're paying the biggest brunt of this crisis. In the unemployment I talked about, 90% have not been able to go to school, and many of the suffering, again, falls under especially girls or the younger age, not least to talk about the enormous level of debt that will again be carried forward to future generations. So it is absolutely imperative that we not only involve the young in everything we do, that we not only give the young a seat at the table, but more importantly, that it is time to give them the table. As you see with Clover, they're more creative, they understand technology, they have an expansive mindset of opportunity, they know better what collaboration is, and yes, they are more purpose-driven and more passionate about their futures. So we, as a generation that we are, it's not our fault, we're trying to do our best, but we need to work harder than what we currently are doing to invite them and to make them part of all these efforts. I'm happy to be part of the UN, where I chair for the Secretary General, the UN Global Compact, and there is an extensive effort behind UN 75 and other things to reach out to the young and to ensure that we include them. And that should be true for all other efforts we are involved in.
Thank you very much. I want to ask a final question and maybe combine it with a question from somebody in the audience. Metropolitan Seraphim Kikotis asked the question whether governments are doing enough to sponsor green business and a green economy. But I would like to combine that with perhaps a slightly more provocative question to all of you. I mean, all of you have worked in business, in consumer business to a certain extent, and we tend to see young people also as young consumers. If I look at what my children have and all the kinds of toys that are produced all over the world, which then end up on the kind of waste treatment center that blows up because there's a methane explosion and people die. Can we educate ourselves and our next generations to do with less? Because at the moment it seems that's not working. Consumerism is just expanding. New products are coming on the market all the time. That seems to be part of our economic cycle. If something is broke, you buy something new. Things break more frequently. This is consumerism. It hasn't stopped, and the young generation is taking part in this. So I think the provocative question is, you know, you're motivating us for a better future, to do more for the environment, but are you prepared to lead a simpler life and not to take part in this consumerism? I'll turn to you, Clover, first.
Okay, so one of my great frustrations is when we equate an individual's moral contribution to climate change to the business leader whose decisions about their value chain, about the products they put out into the world, equate many millions of individuals. And this is a narrative that has largely been co-opted by big companies to put the onus on the consumer, to put the onus on the individual. Now, 71% of emissions come from 100 companies, right? And even in the context of COVID, when we have pressed pause, the reduction in emissions is kind of negligible when we look at the targets that we're setting out to limit degrees of warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So I think we need to break out of this conversation around how we can perhaps shop more sustainably or be a little bit more conscious. I think those decisions are super important to reinforce positive values, represent as a young consumer the brands that you want to align yourself with and the brands that you care about. But otherwise, these decisions need to be made at that level. Now, one of the things that really helped me shift out of the kind of us versus them mentality that I myself held before I started working with business leaders as an environmentalist, was recognizing the universality of the stories of powerlessness. I began to realize that the stories I was hearing from 8-year-olds in the classroom, I was also hearing from business leaders of being too small to make a difference, of the system being too broken to create meaningful change, of it being too difficult to change the status quo. We need to flip that on its head, and we need to, each and every one of us, take responsibility with the privilege and power and opportunity that we are granted to step up, to deliver the solutions, and to paint a picture of the world that we all know is possible.
Thank you so much. Gentlemen, I have to give the final, and I have just given the final word to the lady today. We have no more time left. Thank you for an inspirational panel today, to all of you, wherever you are. And thank you, Clover, for being with us here in the audience. Thank you very much for listening to us, and see you soon.
Thank you. Thank you.